Hey
Hello,
everyone.
everybody. Oh,
Go ahead. Go ahead.
so sorry. Sorry, everybody. I'm Gary Atkins. I am the EAP consultant with Encompass, Encompass EAP, which is provider for some. So with
My
that,
schedule got
what
changed
we
before
have
the fifth,
today.
and I'm on the ES desk now, so, okay.
Yeah, because I'm doing 1 to 4.
Hello, was that for me? Sorry,
No,
DJ.
you're good. You're good.
Okay, I just want to make sure. Okay. So the topic today is going to be rational detachment. So for a lot of us, we often find ourselves in many different capacities and roles in the life. So what we're going to do is we're going to be able to discuss how we can rationally detach as well as figuring out ways in which we can not only not necessarily take things personal, but also find a way to be a healthy, happy version of ourselves. So look, before we begin, a little bit about me. I have been a clinical therapist now for, wow, almost 10 years, so 8 years. So 8 years now. So with that, I've had a lot of experience being able to assist individuals in all, not only all different facets of life, but also all different levels throughout organizational structures. So what we found throughout just not only the most recent years with COVID, but also just like historically in context that a lot of people struggle with being able to detach. And although it's something that's really important for us, a lot of us really put it to something that's on the back burner. So what we want to do is be able to utilize this training as a way in which we can rationally detach as well as get to a version of ourselves that's a little bit more healthier. So when we think about this, we have to think about how we have ever experienced being threatened, being exposed to bodily fluids, being accused by a client, having the client question your professionalism, having supervisors question your professionalism, feeling guilty, afraid, or angry, as well as having to intervene by notifying authorities, security, as well as police officers and clients. So these are some things that we've seen like traditionally on the scale in relation to clinical. But a lot of times we can find ourselves experiencing these different things in a lot of settings in which we may be in. So this isn't necessarily localized to one thing, it's something that we can experience in multiple places. So what is rational attachment? Detachment. Rational detachment is the ability to stay calm, in control, and professional, even in a crisis moment. It means not taking things personally, even button pushing comments that attack your appearance, race, gender, or competence. So, is this something that we've seen for ourselves in the role in which we have? And for a lot of people, we can either comment in the chat and or if we don't, a simple head nod, as DJ just did, a simple head nod is something that can be sufficient in relation to like a lot of us, we've experienced this in some way, shape, or form. But I think when we are necessarily in positions in which elevation and crisis is imminent, it's about how we can stay as calm as possible in a professional way and then being able to best navigate through it afterwards. So for us, when we think about rational detachment, we have questions which we like to answer, right? Why is it important? Why is detachment typically a challenge, as well as how are boundaries set in a detachment related? So for a lot of us, what we know is that we struggle with setting boundaries as not only adults, but just humans in general. Like it can be something as simple as setting boundaries around dinner time at home and or around, do not disturb times at work in which maybe we don't necessarily do it because a lot of us in different ways can feel as though we are more so putting our team or our other coworkers and colleagues at risk of having to do more. But also what we're doing when we're setting these boundaries are putting into place like these structural guidelines. What we're actually doing is we're giving the opportunity for growth. So I think when we're identifying specifically with boundaries, setting boundaries and detachment, I think they're definitely related. But with that, they're related enough to be able to identify how one necessarily helps the other. So in order to have a effective way of detaching from certain situations at work and or high stress situations, we have to get better at setting boundaries. So those things almost go hand in hand to some degree. For a lot of us, when we think about detachment being a challenge, it's usually a challenge in relation to we're just not comfortable with it, right? I don't know, I can't speak for everyone, but I know for me, even in a clinical sense, vulnerability is something I still struggle with. And it's something that there's been a boatload of information as well as statistical research studies that have shown how we can elicit those emotions or elicit that, protective barrier enough to be able to be vulnerable, but it's still something we struggle with to this day. To where I think detachment's a struggle because vulnerability has always been a struggle for us. But by allowing ourselves to detach, we're actually increasing the possibility of not only being vulnerable, but also ensuring that we're taking care of stuff we need to take care of, whether it's at work, at home, you know, in our community settings. I know that it seems though just in a lot of different state spaces in Michigan, we're very community oriented to where we do quite a lot out there in the communities, to where we've been able to kind of really put our energy into stuff that really matters to us. So something to think about when we're identifying what you know, like what it looks like as far as like detachment, we're looking at professionalism. So professionalism, as we know, is a noun. We all know what nouns are. If not, we'll talk about that later. But a noun is, you know, the skill, good judgment, and a polite behavior that is expected from person to person who is trained to do a job well. So with that, when we are in the positions in which maybe something isn't going as well as we thought it would, and or something is more so higher stress, we still want to identify as being professional. I saw a video the other day on it's embarrassing to admit, but TikTok, in which someone's at work and there was a customer in this establishment who came in who was unruly, upset, frustrated, irritable, kind of elevated voice, as well as just high tension points. This individual who was, you know, the one providing the service could have took that as an opportunity to also match that energy. But what they did, which was kind of unique in the videos and what you see on some of these sites, they met the persons where they were. They expressed the concern in which they heard from the individual and identified what are some potential action steps that they can take to be able to have some resolve, right? So they enacted in a way in which it was professional versus what we usually see, which is someone who may be unruly, upset, frustrated, and or elevate to that level of the other person, which then, as we know, if we're elevated and we choose to have someone else be elevated with us, it leads to not very positive things out there. So we want to ensure that when we are in situations in which we're trying to detach as well as, you know, crisis, that we are trying to figure out what remaining professional is. And if you have questions about professionalism, again, email me. I'm open. I'll be able to talk with it and establish like what that could look like in the roles in which we have. So we have quite a different few of them, as well as how we can best navigate through it too. So there are, sorry. So there are 3 strategies that professionals can use to rationally detach and not take action out on other person's behavior. So basically, what we do to be able to detach best is to have, release, and use. So we want to have a plan, want to release negative energy, and want to use self-talk. So when I think of have a plan, I always think about for myself in different situations as today I'm here alone, so I always have my exit routes, right? I have a plan that if someone enters the room that I necessarily don't know and or is during this time which I already have established for something else, I have a plan of like, how can I get out of the building? Or I have a plan in relation to how I cannot engage if someone comes in and is frustrated, upset about maybe a potential appointment being missed and or like something that happened out in the community. So releasing that negative energy would simplistically be enough. Like, how do we release energy in our day-to-day life? I know for me personally, I don't look like it, but I love running. So therefore, like for myself, whenever I have a lot of negative energy and or I feel just like overwhelmed with a lot, I go on a run. The doctor says sometimes that can be healthy and unhealthy depending on how far I go and how fast. But also for me, it helps me kind of get to a point where I can process as well as slow things down enough to be able to have a functional, rational conversation with someone. So for us, it can definitely look different. I had someone the other day say for themselves, when they need to release negative energy, they go on a walk and or they may find themselves, you know, reading a book. Or somebody said they watch what's called trash TV. I never knew what that was until yesterday. But with that, watching trash TV to be able to kind of get the energy out, detach enough to be able to kind of displace the feelings or emotions which they may have onto a character on the screen. And then being able to kind of see not only how that plays out, but also from themselves that that energy is now transferred to something else. So therefore, they're not going to be able to take it with us. And I think something that's instrumental in being able to have this is use of self-talk. For me, I'm been described as like an overly optimistic person. So again, with that like use of self-talk for me is like, how can I get myself in a position where I can be successful through positive psychology? So for myself, I'm utilizing ways in which I can, you know, identify with myself, okay, what's going on? How can I meet the persons where they're at? And if you see a bear, do you get big or get small? Most people get say, you know, you get really big and then you may match their energy. But in this case, you do the opposite. You want to get really small. You want to get small enough to be able to have that person necessarily change their perspective, as well as match the level of voice and echo in which you may have. So using that self-talk, you're able to kind of get yourself into a position in which you're not necessarily going to act out in relation to the other person's behavior or personality, but more so for yourself, how you may do it day to day. So when we're thinking about effective communication, there are like, big things in which we want to really and truly identify with. One is body language, right? And then paraverbals and empathetic words. So these things are like really important because as we're identifying, if we were in this training per se, and I was the presenter sitting back with my arm crossed, just kind of rocking back and forth, and or just looking disgruntled, that may not necessarily give across the best message, right? That may identify for the people in this training that I may not want to be here. I may have other things on my mind, right? So where that would necessarily derail the what we're trying to accomplish with this training. So therefore, when we're having, effective communication, we're ensuring that our body language is very, open. We're communicative. We have nonverbals, right? Using more words of empathy versus words that are kind of, derailing in relation to the negativity, right? Empathetic words are words in which can essentially empower those around us. So therefore, when we're utilizing that, what we're doing is we're giving people also the same permission to do the same. So whenever I teach effective communication in a clinical setting, a lot of the times I tell people what's really important is like we're identifying as well as modifying our pitch, tone, and presentation. I call it like a triangle. We all know what a triangle, the shape is, to where when we're kind of in those settings, when we're trying to have effective communication, we identify are we hitting each kind of side of that wall. And if we are, usually what happens is someone's more open as well as willing to discuss with us. But if we're not, and we find that maybe we're not having those positive interactions, that's usually a sign to step back and take a look at that and see what kind of pillar am I missing in this capacity. And, if we're able to figure that out and transition and change that, a lot of people are going to be more open to have those kind of conversations. So there's 3 states of the mind that a lot of us may or may not be aware of. For a lot of us, we like to think that we operate in the center, which is the wise mind. But depending on different situation and circumstances around us, we may find ourselves more so in the reasonable mind and the emotional mind. So what happens when we're in these different spaces, we find ourselves maybe responding in ways in which could be a lot quicker than we'd like to. So I always say we find ourselves when we are in the emotional mind, we may respond in ways in which we identify as our protectors. But again, those protectors in which we have up, that barrier, may necessarily be also something that hurts us. Because in that emotional state of mind, we're not necessarily thinking about other people, we're thinking about self-preservation, which is not a bad thing, right? We definitely want to have self-preservation. But also we want to ensure that when we're working with people as well as trying to detach, that we are allowing ourselves to be able to process emotion to some degree. So that's like when you find yourself in that wise mind, where I feel this and I know this, so I would do this, right? So our wise mind is kind of really taking the blend of both states of the mind and making it to where it's like that fully functional. It's like the id, ego, and superego in psychology. So it's like, we're ensuring that we're really crossing over to ensure that we're getting everything we need in communication. So within our reasonable mind, we have logic, statistics, research, past experience, which is good, but also again, right, when we're talking with somebody who could be in distress and or working in situations in which like we're just overwhelmed. If we're more in the reasonable mind, we may find ourselves pointing to things that are important, but also may derail what we're trying to accomplish. I'll use an example. If you have a supervisor that's coming to you and they're identifying with the notion of, okay, there's some, Gary, you did really well last month, but this month we really need you to focus on being able to ensure that you're hitting the quota of meeting 50 clients. And then, maybe at the end of the year, we'll compensate with the raise. For me, if I'm in my reasonable mind state and I know that past experiences has identified I've hit that mark and maybe I'm not getting that raise, maybe I'm not getting that, reward, my then reasonable mind may identify I'm not doing that. I'll hit my 45 and then we'll kind of discuss at the end of the year and I'll be okay with that, right? But if I'm in that wise mind, I'll be able to understand as well as rationalize enough to be able to identify. I'll hit my goal, but also when we get to the end of the year, we're going to have a functional conversation about what this could look like as far as the continuity. So tips to help practice healthy detachment. Respond, don't react. For a lot of us, when we respond to certain things, we react more so than we truly believe we do. So I know for me, if I'm frustrated or irritated by something, text messages, I like them, I don't. For that reason, right, we can typically shoot something off really quickly as far as a message, but then later in the day, we may read and identify, ooh, wait a minute, maybe that wasn't the most appropriate way to say that. And or maybe I didn't give a message across because I got like a dot, 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 the ellipses, the dot, dot, dot. And this is, ooh, that means I'm in trouble. What'd I do? Okay, I responded, I have reaction more so than being able to function, look at that information. So when we're practicing healthy detachment, we want to ensure that we are responding, not more so reacting out of emotion. And that goes into that, the reasonable mind, the wise mind, and the emotional mind. That would be more so in the emotional mind if we're reacting. Have a plan for what you want to say and do with difficult people. So we've all dealt with difficult people to some degree, I would imagine. If not, we are very lucky. But with that, when we find ourselves dealing with difficult people, we want to ensure that if we know that we're typically triggered by, let's say, someone who has a very commanding voice, as well as uses a lot of nonverbals in an aggressive type way, want to have a plan, like we don't have to be specific, but somewhat of a generalized plan to be able to identify how we can navigate if we are in a situation in which that may present itself. So for me, I am a person who typically I get a little bit overwhelmed when I have someone in the room that's just like very much maybe commanding in speech. So for me, like my automatic nonverbal sometimes is to kind of shrink down and identify with, oh man, this is a person that's really mad, and they're gonna have like a high opinion that I cannot necessarily help. Right, I'm gonna have to help navigate through at some point, but also there's gonna be a lot of tension in the room. So for me, I always have to have a plan in relation to that, right? So instead of allowing myself to shrink down, I just not necessarily get as big as them because I don't want to do that. I don't want to irritate, but also allow myself to kind of sit, posture forward, identify with some of the things in which I heard, right? Responding, not reacting to what they're giving off, as well as then kind of making a plan with them. So with me having a plan, it helps them have a plan. So we also want to use container visualization method, which essentially means kind of put it in a box. So with putting it in a box, some of these different, things that are necessarily distressing and or when we're trying to detach, what we're doing is we're visualizing as we do our triangle. Are we meeting everything within our power, but also are we going to be able to successfully follow through? So our container is going to be like our safety net. So it's almost essentially like your bubble. You want to find a partner. So finding a partner is really important because what it does is it can assist you with kind of practicing skills as well as it's kind of like accountability. So for us, we have a supervisor. So whenever I am in a position in which maybe I feel as though detachment haven't been able to do it, I find myself carrying stuff with me place to place, I typically have an accountability partner, which is my supervisor. We'll talk about it, we'll chat, will identify, what I can and can't do, like as far as that locus of control. And then we'll identify, okay, Gary, right, what's your plan? How can we assess and fix for this? And then what do you need from us? Where usually we can kind of come up with something that can help kind of mitigate some of these things to where the partner does a lot more than just give you somebody to practice with, it gives you accountability, as well as assess your body language, right? If we're meeting someone big and we're going up big like a bear, sometimes it's going to be something that's deemed as an attack. Where if we're assessing our body language and meeting them with more openness, in our clinical practices, we're normally taught to sit forward with your palms up, kind of like I always call it like playing basketball, where like your palms up, you're playing defense essentially, but also in an open way versus closed off like you're taking a charge. To where a lot of people, if we're that way, they may not necessarily want to feel comfortable speaking with us, as well as, identifying for ourselves how we can get around that. So what are reasonable facts? Sometimes when we're thinking about detachment, we want to be able to think about, ways in which we can necessarily identify how we're going to get there. So reasonable thoughts in relation to, I am a good person. I'm here to do a job and I'm not responsible for all the things involved in that job, right? Because sometimes for sure, a lot of us fall into that category of everything just kind of falls on our shoulders. And if something fails, then we're a failure, but we're not, right? We're still a good person. We can still do difficult things, and maybe some things aren't necessarily within that responsibility. And I do not have to be responsible for you, and you are upset, right? I think that's huge because sometimes when someone is upset, oftentimes in some capacities, our identification with it is we're then responsible for their level of frustration, and or we have to identify and say, how can I fix it? Or sometimes we can't. Sometimes we have to get to the point where we're getting them the help, whether it's like, a therapist and or like a different supervisor and or somebody else that they can get the assistance from. And that you do not have to take responsibility for your poor emotion regulation. That can be difficult, right? But then again, sometimes we have to remind ourselves we are human. We're gonna have like these setbacks and things that can derail us. So when we do, we have to then be able to identify collectively and or individually what that could look like. And that I do not have to be vulnerable to your anger and opinions. That's huge because a lot of time when we are vulnerable to anger and our opinions, we get ourselves to the point where we're frustrated and then we act out of impulse instead of control. So we want to ensure that when we are trying to be reasonable, that we don't necessarily do that. So now we're going to talk about emotional reaction and reasonable reaction. So when we're thinking about emotional reaction, one thing could be responsibilities, right? Sometimes we often feel responsible for things that, again, we talked about before, may not be our responsibility and or may be beyond our locus of control. So when we're thinking about a reasonable reaction to something like that, we'd identify we need to set better boundaries, right? We need to be able to let colleagues and or, sometimes even consumers or clients know that there are certain boundaries in which we typically try to follow. So therefore, we're setting ourselves up to not necessarily react in a way in which when we have the responsibility, we're going to feel a lot of different emotions and it's going to displace us in relation to expression, as well as how we're navigating throughout the day, as well as like what we carry with us home. Because a lot of times if we have these interactions that aren't necessarily positive, we'll take it with us. So again, right, if we're able to create detached distance, they won't necessarily have the emotional reaction of guilt, hurt feelings, anger, and fear. So when we're thinking about having those emotions, what we want to do is kind of create a little bit of distance because a lot of times that just means that maybe we're kind of too close. My grandma was a strong proponent of like, sometimes the heat in the kitchen's too hot, so you might need to step out of the kitchen for a minute. And that's totally fine. Like I didn't get it as a kid, but as an adult, I get it. Like in the figurative set and the literal set, when it's hot in the kitchen, like you got the making sauce and it goes into a flame, that's not fun. On TV, they make it look fun. In real life, it's not fun. In a sense that, right, sometimes you have to be able to take a step back in an appropriate manner. So for us, a lot of times we're in these heat of the moment situations, taking a step back and creating that distance, whether it's taking a day off, right? Being able to take a lunch break and get away from the situation. I know for me, lunch breaks usually entail me getting as far away from my building as I can. So I get back in time, but also I kind of go on a walk or get away from things. That way I can kind of really identify with different processes as well as how I can effectively work with things. So the art of setting the limit. So setting limits, so when we're trying to set limits, what we're trying to do is try to set positive limits and you'll see the effects of different choices and what it may be as far as like rather than ultimatums. So if a person refuses to do classwork, a negative limit could be if you don't do your classwork, you won't have any free time. A positive limit could be after your work is done, you'll have 5 minutes of free time, right? I always say like it's like that cause analysis type intervention to where again, we're giving them something that is going to hopefully be more so on that positive limit versus that negative limit, although some people gravitate towards that. So one is going to be, putting your phone away. If you don't put your phone away, you'll go to the office. Where would you like to put your phone away in the office or go to the office, right? So where basically what this setting limits is going to be, right? You're going to identify with the notion of cause and effect as well as positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. So there's definitely reinforcement, which we have in either way when we are dealing with set limits as well as working through detachment. So for us, we have to identify in those situations. So one that may be relevant is, stop yelling. If you don't stop yelling, you have to leave. Where a positive limit would be when you stop yelling, you can find a situation and solution to what's bothering you. So therefore, if you're able to kind of shift and switch these things in relation to more positivity versus negativity, we may find ourselves more in that, wise mind, which then gets us to be able to fully functionally think through situations, as well as get to the place in which we feel good. So strategic visualization, the team approach, right? So as we think about team approach, what we think about is how we can work together effectively through collaboration to accomplish a goal. So for a lot of us, team approach can definitely be difficult to some degree, and it can also elicit different emotions because as I'd imagine, a lot of different companies and organizations now are becoming more diverse. So sometimes with diverse skill sets, we have different variations of opinion. So where it can, elicit some hostility and frustration. But also that hostility and frustration only goes as far as we have it, right? Because if we're meeting that person with hostility and frustration, as well as not necessarily going into it with an open mindset, as typical like trainings have taught us, then we're gonna not get anywhere. We're gonna necessarily not have the best team approach. as well as we're not going to have somebody that has their back. So when we have the team approach and we're going into it with openness, we're going to ensure that there's someone there to back you up, as well as it makes it easier to maintain your professionalism. So you want to be able to have people around you when you do have these situations. So for me, although today not many people around where I'm at, the building is very empty, but usually if I'm meeting with someone who may be hostile and or irritable, and or if it's a colleague that's frustratable, I want to have somebody else that's there with me, so that way I have like not only somebody that can assist if I need it, but also like sometimes it's good to have another person around in case you need to debrief afterwards. So a team approach is having somebody readily available when you may need them. So you want to be able to know your personal limits. So know yours. It's okay to ask for help. And I think the biggest thing is like you are human. We're not robots. I know AI is coming up quick, but with that, we're not to that point where we're gonna, have to hopefully rely on it too much. So when we are setting our personal limits, it's like we have to know our personal boundaries. So that's like, as we identify, knowing what our barriers are gonna be, knowing how we necessarily react to different situations, as well as what our plan can be in those situations, as well as how we're going to use self-talk to be able to assist ourselves when we feel as though we are getting derailed to some degree. So when we're knowing our limits and we're able to effectively work through these concerns, we're going to find that there will be less and less of the frustration later. So we're using positive self-talk. We must remind ourselves that if you are the target of an outburst or negative situation, you are really the cause of the actual behavior. And I think that's hard to identify with in those moments, because usually when we're in those situations in which someone is coming to us in a frustrated way, we feel as though we're 100% of the problem, as well as we're 100% of the reason for their negative outbursts. But I think, at the end of the day, like a lot of us go through difficult things day in and day out. And although we can't necessarily always know if someone's struggling, we can kind of lend a helping hand if we have it. And if not, that's us knowing our boundary to identify, okay, I definitely understand like there's a high frustration point. So how about I help assist to get you to somebody who would be able to assist with this in this moment? Which a lot of times if I have a client who's frustrated or irritable or upset, I'll then get them to my supervisor, to where it's like then they're able to not only express their frustration if I think it may be with them, so not directly to me, but also if it's not and they feel more comfortable with somebody else, they can utilize it in that way. So again, it goes to that analogy, whether you can think it or you can't, you're right. So a lot of time when we are trying to detach, as well as, working through irritability, we want to provide ourselves with debrief and discussion. So when an incident does occur with the person in your workplace, debrief your team members on what happened. So we want to ensure that, debriefing techniques we're utilizing is giving individuals a space to be able to talk, being able to provide empathy, as well as being able to provide the openness of communication to changes if we need to. So a lot of times when we have an individual who could be irritable, upset, and or frustrated to that degree, or saw a big incident happening, the way to debrief is to have an employee assistance program, an EAP, go in to be able to provide just like normal reactions to abnormal events, as well as like group therapy and individual therapy. So those are like techniques and like a plan, as we talked about before, having a plan. Having a plan will come into play, because then what you're doing is you're allowing people a space to be able to operate, as well as giving them the opportunity to discuss emotions in which they may end up utilizing or kind of outwardly having to other people. So this is kind of the way in which it kind of feeds into himself. And that's essentially why having staff consistency matters, because the more consistent staff we have, not necessarily, it won't be easier, but like the more we'll know the person. So where am today, they have an acronym like a hey yo, and it's like, hey, are you okay? It's like their way here of a non-invasive question that they can ask, as well as a way in which they can get information if they need it. So if you see somebody struggling, it's almost better to say something if you see it than not. But also, like if it's maybe not the most comfortable person and or that you don't know, like a simple hey yo, like hey, are you okay? And because it gives you the time to explain what it means, as well as gives you like that connection point with them that allows you to be able to talk with them. So that can be like a good thing to establish. So when we're thinking about how we can, have like that reasonable attachment, what we're going to have is going to have balance and self-care. So for a lot of us, when we are in high stress, we necessarily don't provide ourselves with that balance. We may find ourselves more irritable, frustratable, just going home and kind of going through the motions. But I think a lot of time we have to identify how we can provide ourselves balance. So I think big things when we're thinking about it is, identifying potential fun at work, being able to have relaxation and downtime, being able to have a positive support system, healthy sleep hygiene, as well as like healthy eating habits. Like these are things that lead to more so optimism as well as assurance that we're going to be in a balanced place. I always tell people it's kind of like our cell phones. When we go to bed at night, sometimes if the battery in our phone is discharged enough or drained enough, we'll find ourselves charging that phone. And then we don't ask questions, we kind of do it because it's kind of an expectation. I always question people, why don't we do that for ourselves? Why don't we allow ourselves to be able to have that balance, have that space, and have that break as you do with the device that typically we need for the most part, but maybe is more of a commodity to where that's where we have to begin to question if we are finding ourselves a little bit more irritable and frustrated and kind of, with oomph, is that for ourselves? What are we doing to provide that balance and self-care? So I think if there's anything that you take from this today, is like, it's the identification of, what can I do for self-care, as well as how can I provide myself that balance. So types of self-care, there's the emotional, physical, mental, social, spiritual, practical, and professional. So we'll start at the bottom. So professional self-care would be essentially going to see a clinician. So with that, a lot of different entities have like different EAP systems, as well as just our insurance. When we pick an insurance plan, a lot of us have some sort of coverage for mental health. It definitely is different case by case, but also it can be a good thing to check into. I always tell people, if you're not aware, just reach out. Insurance providers usually have a behavioral health team that can help with that. But if not, there's usually just like the intake line who'll be able to assist to identify, again, like what kind of coverage we have for mental health, as well as where our potential, suitors that are in the area that can assist with that. So for us, like when we're thinking practical and spiritual, we're thinking of ways in which we can have that release that is amongst other people. So social also kind of falls into that. So, if some individuals really find faith is really important. So being able to, attend church if that's it, and or attend like different groups or seminars, different things like that, or just being around people essentially sometimes helps with self-care, because not only does it take the attention away from just specifically us, it also gives us something that we can, get ourselves ingrained in, as well as mentally prepare for, that doesn't necessarily have to deal with the nuances of day in and day out. So that would be like, if it's for me, it's maybe going on a run, which could fit into the physical component of self-care, but I like to go run in a group. So I'll go to the Grand Rapids, what's the Grand Rapids Running Club, and I'll go for a couple long runs with them a month. But usually I'm a loner, so I do it by myself. So right, like being able to figure out that balance point of like what you may need as far as self-care. And I think like a big one, like when we're thinking about mental self-care, is like, what are we doing to help alleviate the level of stress we feel that we're under? So whether that's, again, talking to someone, whether it's identifying with prioritization lists and figuring out where we can necessarily, put something off to the next day versus having to feel stressed out. I always tell people when we're thinking about the mental component and self-care, sometimes as simple as like a prioritization list, to we make one of those, identify the top 2 to 3 that we're going to get done, and then just accomplishing those. And if we're feeling, good and we can do more, we do more. But if not, been able to step away and say, you know what, today I did do a day and I am good enough in that moment. I see we have a question. Okay.
I was gonna say once we're finished with the presentation, we can open up for questions, but people can drop them in the chat as we go.
Yeah. Okay. So when thinking about stress management, some of the takeaways I want to have is that you can choose to be the bridge so everyone can get it safely, or you can be the path that gets walked over. So I tell people that a lot of time when we are thinking about assistance, as well as how we can identify with stress management, we can provide ourselves with the wraparound. So with that, wrap around to me means a hug. So we have that physical, emotional support, as well as like, what are those resources I have? So that way, when like we're thinking about stress management, as well as like how we're going to navigate through, as well as how we can teach people to navigate through, just think about a hug. Want to have the physical, emotional component, as well as the resources there. I'm not gonna go hug people. Don't do that. I want you to do that. I just want you to think like I have that analogy of, okay, am I meeting the two needs that typically people may have? Then how can I assist from that point? So by choosing to, you know, be more so the bridge, you're assisting with them being able to have longevity versus just kind of do it for them. So beyond rational attachment applies to situations as well as people. We want to ensure that we are keeping as calm as possible, and making it really makes the world different, right? It makes us, for keeping calm and being able to rationalize, we're going to make the situation turn out a little bit different. But if we meet that person with irrationality, or that situation with irrational ability, what happens is we're going to elevate it, which then gets us to a point where we maybe make a situation worse. We're going to say maybe because I hope we don't. I hope we identify and step away from. But if we are not keeping, but if we keep calm, we're going to be able to then have our wise mind more so in play. Then rational detachment can be a light that can help you see out of a tough situation. So I always say that something I was taught from a young age was like, in the darkest moment of the night, the sun begins to shine. So therefore, a lot of times when we are in dark situations, we can find it not only all too consuming, but also it can kind of put us in a position to where maybe we're not seeing things as we once did, and or we're finding ourselves stuck and we don't know what to do. So therefore, sometimes we can choose to do nothing. But also when we're trying to operate in that moment of like that sunshine or being that light, what we'll do is by having that detachment, we'll be able to effectively work towards that. We'll have like our plan of like, okay, I know the sun comes up at 6. I have these things I gotta get done before then. So for us, we're giving ourselves permission to act instead of react, in a sense that our responses are going to be a little bit better than it would if we just automatically kind of triggered off something. So with that, I'm going to open it up for questions, if that's okay with you, DJ.
Sounds good. I'll just kick it off with the first question in the chat. Feel free if anyone needs to drop questions in the chat, because maybe they're at desk or they can't get audio to work. Feel free, I'll read them off, but you can also come off mute if you like. But the first question is, how can managers encourage debriefing and um, prevent it from becoming dwelling from a difficult situation?
I think it would be important in that kind of situation, in that, to like provide the openness and opportunity for it. Because a lot of times, like even for myself, I've been in like workplaces that maybe had a triggering event. So when we're looking to provide debriefing, what's helped is like having the space available to it, as well as like having that encouragement. And I think like as we are having people come in and share. I think if we're going to have it, and that maybe not have an employee assistance program there be either, right? If it's just us doing it on our own, setting up those limits, right? Setting up those boundaries that whatever's here stays here, right? Essentially, whatever we identify with or could be of concern, we'll have it just be amongst the group and not something that's discussed afterwards. To where you're setting that precedent of, we have our system and our structure and how we follow this. And then this is what we're looking for as far as like, responsibility of members. And if like we can't do that, I would recommend having that person, if they have to leave, say, we can still provide the debrief for you, but may just be more in a professional setting where someone would come in and do it. So where you can definitely set it up. It's just about having those limits as well as like those boundaries set up. And I think in order to, not necessarily not have it be negative, you can have it be negative, but also like if you have that negativity, maybe that's where like that make a plan comes into play. Because like within that negativity, a lot of us were looking for some kind of sort of solution in a way which we can navigate through. So maybe having that identification with, okay, I understand the concerns and frustrations of this situation. So how would you all as a unit like to move forward? Right? How we like to accomplish the end goal, which is maybe safety and security. So everybody has like a joint investment in it. And that's how like I've noticed, like, 'cause I do a lot, not a lot, I won't say a lot. That's not, I do quite a few debriefs. So therefore, when I'm doing these, when I have that stage set, as well as I give that opportunity for feedback, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be able to implement it, not maybe in the way in which they'd like you to, but also maybe you can then piggyback off of that and make it something that's successful for all those around you. Absolutely.
Okay, so feel free and come off mute if anyone wants to ask a question, um, or drop it in the chat. I'm keeping an eye on the chat as well. Michelle said, can you talk a little bit more about the container visualization method?
Mm-hmm. So container visualization method, let me pull that up really quick. I think I have. So with the container visualization method, as we were talking about earlier, it's essentially identifying like, right, what are those boundaries or bounds in which we can have. So what we're looking to have is kind of like our triangle where we have each side of the container. So give me 1 second. There is, if I could. Oh no, that slide deleted. Give me 1 second. I know it's here. Because I can pull up exactly what it is in like more specific terms for you.
While you're looking that up, just real quick, there was a question on whether or not this recording would be made available to all. It will end up on our YouTube page where you can come and reference back to it, or if there's anyone that you know that didn't make it to this session, they can watch it there as well.
Okay, so the container visualization method, that's what it's described, right? It's like you envision that we have a container with 4 sides. So therefore, this is utilized a lot primarily in EMDR, which is like a lot for like trauma, as well as like assisting individuals who may have been in a traumatic experience. So what you do is you have an individual who would be experiencing difficulty between in stressful situations, being able to slow down and process information in a safe space. So what this looks like is you would have the individual or yourself, right, in these moments, you'll want the individual to have kind of some sort of container in the eyes, mind, as well as a secure space in the room. So you're providing safety and security in that degree. And that this container which you're visualizing will be able to hold all disturbing stuff, such as memories, images, thoughts, the physical, emotional, mental smells, things like that. So with this container, a big question is, what would this container have to be like in order to safely secure distress? So for a lot of us, when we have a container or a space in which we think we'd utilize for information like that, we want something like a file cabinet, right? So where you kind of have drawers open and closed, being able to identify with like, physically what it may look like, as well as like how we can implement this. Because a lot of with the container, it's like a visualization exercise. So we're doing is like we're visualizing our container that can provide us with what we need. So what do we need in that capacity to feel safe and secure, as well as what would be the most likely container which we have. So again, that's why you said the storage unit. So now we're gonna imagine taking the distressing image and putting them inside or send them to the container. So it's our way of getting them out of here and more so into an open space. So it's metaphorical. So with that, we'd be able to say, okay, for me, it may be a colleague or coworker, we didn't get along well today. They slammed the door before I left. So maybe them slamming the door is a triggering event for me. So by me utilizing the container method, what I do is I take that visualization of the door being shut and kind of displace it into my container. So what that is like, that's my safety spot, as well as where I will put some of those information or pieces that may be too hard to carry around into. So what it is like it's an exercise in which you are given information and space to live, but not necessarily having to carry you with you, to each moment. But like it's like a big it's a whole like script for it. I don't want to do the whole script, but essentially that's what it is, right? It's like being able to have that displacement into something else.
I have a question I'll throw in. Ooh. So sometimes in libraries, you might be interacting with the same patron who might, be coming with their attitude or something often. What happens when you're interacting with the same person frequently and you need to rationally detach almost every time you interact with them?
See, that'd be pretty tricky because, like you said, especially like if it's like known. But I think that that can also be a place where we set realistic expectations. To say like this person is someone who's gonna come in, they're pretty upset most of the time. So I'm not gonna anticipate they're always gonna be upset, but I'm just gonna continually meet them with gentleness or kindness to some degree to where when we're able to do that, but also not get our expectations. So we're gonna come in, smile, and say, "It was great seeing you today, Gary. Thank you for helping out." Usually that may not be the case to where we set those expectations, but also know that throughout time, if we're kind of meeting them with what we like, as well as with that openness, sometimes people become more open. Sometimes you may find that that patron, you know, that is irritable or upset, they may come in and just spill all their beans at once. You might not be ready for it. But then again, right, if you're practicing what you like for them, they sometimes will often find reciprocity in it. And because I've been in libraries as well, when there's someone looking for a book, they got really upset and frustrated, and then just like man, just had a huge array of like words that I was like, oh man, there's a lot of kids in here. But with that, I think like throughout time, even for them, like in those situations, like a good de-escalation tip that I saw from the librarian at that point was identification with that person, you know, validating those feelings, but also identifying, you know, is there a way in which we can assist, you know, make this experience better for you? So even something like that could help because maybe it is, you know, not only a lot of different life stuff, but it could be tricky to navigate through at times to where often stuff like that.
Okay, any other questions? I know we're at noon, so if anyone has to bounce out, that's fine, but I want to make sure that everyone has space to get their questions asked. Well, thank you, Gary, for this presentation. This was really informative. I think everyone got something out of it, which I appreciate. Like I mentioned, this will be available on our YouTube page. If you feel like you want to re-watch it or just share, you'll be able to access that.
And thank you for having me. If there's any questions that come up afterwards here, just don't hesitate to email me.
Sounds good. Sounds good.
All right. Thank you.
Take care.